This essay example, as well as thousands of others, is available in text format on our website for free and without registration. Simply Google Ivy Panda Free Essays.
Introduction. How does tourism affect animals? Wildlife tourism is basically the viewing of wild animals in their natural habitats. Tourism affects the ecosystem of wildlife both positively and negatively. Tourism can lead to interference and destruction of the wildlife ecosystem, leading to a decrease in the population of the animals and degradation of their habitats. Tourists will interfere with the welfare of the wild animals through their interactions with the animals. The roads and paths that offer access to wild animals also lead to the destruction of the natural habitat of the wild animals. Tourism can also have numerous positive effects on wildlife. Due to the huge incomes that tourism generates, authorities and local communities will aim at preserving the natural habitat of the animals for continued gains in the future. Part of the money earned from tourism can be used for the conservation of endangered species and safeguarding the habitat of wild animals through fencing. Thesis statement. Although wildlife tourism is common in various countries, it has negative effects on wildlife. Positive and negative impacts of wildlife tourism. Tourism is known to finance conservation efforts for wildlife. Opponents of the argument that tourism negatively affects wildlife claim that tourism, in fact, promotes conservation efforts of wildlife and their habitat through the provision of financial aid. They argue that part of the revenue obtained from tourism is channeled back to conservation efforts of wildlife, like the conservation of endangered species. They also argue that local communities and authorities are dedicated to conserving wildlife primarily because of tourism, as most of them earn their living through tourism-related activities. Rebuttal to the argument that tourism finances conservation efforts of wildlife and their habitats. Tourism leads to the destruction and interference of wildlife's habitat. In places with wildlife that attracts tourists, part of the wildlife's habitat is cleared in order to pave the way for the construction of amenities that meet the needs of tourists, like resorts. Tourists may engage in off-road driving and walking through wildlife habitats, which leads to the trampling of vegetation and the death of small living creatures. Tourism leads to the disturbance of normal activities of wildlife. Tourism disrupts the feeding and breeding patterns of wildlife. Tourists move too close to animals with the aim of viewing and taking photographs. The animals become aware of the presence of humans and cannot continue with their routine activities. A study in Mexico reveals a decrease in the breeding of brown pelicans by 52 to 100% in areas frequented by tourists compared to areas not visited by tourists. Tourists disrupt the bonding between parent and offspring. In Canada, female harp seals' attendance at their pups was reduced when tourists were present. Tourism activities create awareness of conservation efforts for endangered species. Opponents of the argument that tourism negatively affects wildlife claim that tourism creates awareness of the conservation of endangered species. Some tourists engage in studying the ecosystem and create awareness to raise funds for various projects aimed at the conservation of the ecosystem. Rebuttal to the argument that tourism creates awareness on conservation efforts of endangered species. Tourism activities may lead to increased vulnerability of some species to predators. Viewing certain species of wildlife may expose them to predators, leading to a decrease in their population. Certain tourism activities may scare away wildlife from their habitat. In Kenya, increased observation of cheetahs drives them away from their habitat into community farms. Tourism increases cases of poaching and game hunting. Poachers masquerading as tourists gain access to wildlife that have body parts with high monetary value, like elephant tusks. Controlling poaching becomes difficult and expensive. Tourists also contribute to the decreased population of wildlife through activities like game hunting and sport fishing. The effects can be severe without proper regulation of these activities. The growing practice of ecotourism offers great benefits to wildlife. Opponents of the argument that tourism negatively affects wildlife claim that with the increase in the practice of ecotourism, greater care is taken to educate tourists about the need to preserve wildlife and their habitat. Rebuttal of the argument that ecotourism offers benefits to wildlife. Tourism activities like noise and feeding of wildlife affect the behavior and welfare of wildlife. In the Galapagos Islands, artificial feeding led to the disruption of the breeding patterns of iguanas. Noise generated by motorboats and engines of motor vehicles as tourists move closer to the animals tends to disturb the feeding and drinking patterns of wildlife. Tourism leads to decreased pollution of the wildlife habitat. Tourists lead to pollution of the habitat through littering and noise pollution, which tend to scare wild animals. The use of vehicles and motorboats leads to further pollution of the environment. Burning firewood to provide warmth in resorts leads to environmental pollution. Conclusion: negative effects of tourism on wildlife. Wildlife tourism is a major source of revenue for countries in Africa and South American countries. However, without proper coordination, it can negatively impact the wildlife and their habitat. For sustainable tourism, structures should be put in place to minimize the negative effects of tourism on wildlife. Efforts to educate tourists on conserving wildlife should be practiced. Did you like this Impact of Tourism on Wildlife Conservation sample? To get more works like this one, make sure to check out the database of academic paper examples at ivpanda.com. You will find thousands of samples for all your study needs.